All right, so as you saw right there, we are beginning a new sermon series today called World Reframed. And I'm really excited about this series. I think pastors say that every time they start a series. This is the best series we're ever going to do. But I mean it. I mean it today. I mean it this time. I'm really excited about this. We're talking about how the world is often seen through lenses that are fragmented, that are smudged, that just don't make sense of the world that we live in. I quoted this guy last week, Yuval Harari, who says that we live life in an age of bewilderment, where the old stories have collapsed and the no new stories have emerged so far to replace them. And we talked about how that's true, that we live life in an age of bewilderment. People are confused, they don't know how to make sense of the world that they find themselves in. But what I said last week and what I'll continue to say is that actually the old stories haven't collapsed, but that if we give a particular old story, the biblical story, especially these fundamental chapters of Genesis 1 to 3, if we give this old story a fresh reading, if we understand it rightly, then it provides the lens through which we make sense of the world. And we're going to be looking at all kinds of different issues and themes through this lens. And today we're starting with the big one, the biggest one possible. And I know some of us are eager to get onto some of the more titillating topics, environmentalism, relationships, those kinds of things. But we got to start with the most fundamental, basic question there is, which is, who is God? Does he exist? And if he does, what is he like? Everything else kind of flows from the answer to that question. And it won't surprise you to hear that there are all kinds of different perspectives about who God is in our world today. On the one hand, you would have the so-called new atheists, who aren't really that new anymore. They're guys like Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins. These guys are not as cordial as atheists of a former generation were. They are violently, aggressively anti-religion. Dawkins has said that one of the world's greatest evils is faith in God. It's not just a matter of believing in God being a crutch for the weak. It's that you're an idiot and irresponsible if you do believe it. So you've got that over there. You've got kind of the popularity of Eastern thought, which kind of identifies nature or creation as a whole with God. So God's not so much personal as just kind of being part of creation itself, found everywhere and in everything. Ace Ventura actor and apparently aspiring theologian Jim Carrey says it this way. He says that every cell in your body is God, everything is God, everything is divine. Okay, so that's one perspective, and that's probably a pretty popular perspective on the West Coast among kind of New Age, hippie-ish types of people and ways of thinking. And you'll probably know people who have that perspective. A third perspective, among many others, would come from a guy like Douglas Coupland. I went through a phase in my early 20s where I read every novel that he had written pretty much. He's a local author who popularized the term Generation X. And he said in an interview that I read once that his greatest fear was that God exists, but that he doesn't care very much for human beings. So God does exist, but he doesn't care very much about human beings. And of course, you'd have all kinds of other perspectives as well. Now let's look at what happens if we use Genesis 1, especially as the frame through which to see God. Let's look at what kind of image that produces. And we're going to start in Genesis 1, verse 1. We're going to be bouncing around a little bit. We're not going to be going through this passage sequentially. I'm going to pull out verses kind of from here or there, just so you're kind of aware. But the overall view of Genesis 1 is 1 and 2 is kind of an introduction, a prologue. And then verses 3 on through the rest of the chapter is structured as kind of like a 6-day work week where God is making the world. So that's kind of the structure of Genesis 1. Genesis 1 verse 1, very first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, that is actually a really packed sentence, and there are all kinds of things that we could talk about further there, but here's what I think that we could all agree on, that this verse clearly says that God is creator. Again and again in the Bible, if you ask the question, where does everything come from? you'll get the same answer throughout. It's God. God's the creator. He's the maker of life. He's the source of life. That's who he is. God is creator. And that is just a kind of a fundamental reality of the Bible. That God has made the world, and that implies that the world has a beginning. That there was a time when the world wasn't, and God did something to change that. And this is actually already an important claim, because in Eastern thinking, in much of Eastern thinking, the world is eternal. It doesn't have a beginning or an end. It goes on forever and ever. And so the gods, or the divine, which is associated with creation, is just kind of within that. It's eternal because the world is eternal. But Genesis says that God is separate from his creation, and that he makes it come into being. That's a very different kind of claim. Now, on the question of whether or not the world has a beginning or not, modern science answers that pretty clearly, that yes, the world did have a beginning. This is the Big Bang Theory that says that the universe is expanding, and you can track it all back to something that they call the singularity, and it kind of exploded and kind of went from there. But of course, the question still is, where did that singularity come from? Where did that original, couple of atoms or whatever it is, where did that come from? Now, this is actually the foundation for what is called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. You ready for this? You ready for some philosophy here this morning? 3 people nod their heads. Okay. Cosmological argument for the existence of God. I want to just spend a little bit of time here. I think this is important to say. Believing that God exists is a very reasonable thing to do. The cosmological argument, first step, says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. So you and I began to exist at some point, and that had a cause. Our parents did something. If you're not sure what, you can ask your parents afterwards. This building exists. It had a cause. People dreamt it up. They planned it. They built it. This building, it began to exist. There was a cause for that. Even our roles and our functions, my role as lead pastor, there was a cause for that. Strictly humanly speaking, the membership of this church got together and said, let's hire this guy to be our pastor, which probably will be called into question at some point in this series, because I think I'll upset everybody at some point, but it'll be important to remember the cause. So everything that begins to exist has a cause. Second step is to say that the universe has a beginning. Again, this is what we were just talking about. This is what science clearly shows, that the world had a beginning. Therefore, third step, the universe has a cause. And you can push that even further. And you could say that the cause must be timeless, outside of time, without cause itself. Otherwise, we've just pushed the argument one step further. The cause has to be eternal and timeless in order for this to work. The cause has to be pretty powerful. To make something out of nothing, that takes quite a bit of power. And probably you would also say that this cause has to be personal. Because to create is a choice. It's an act that a free agent, not in the sports sense, but in the philosophical sense, can make. So right away, even with this argument, we're getting pretty close to what we see in Genesis 1 in terms of who God is. A personal, powerful, eternal being. Now, what do you do if you're somebody who says the world had a beginning, but you don't want to admit the existence of God? What do you do with that? Well, here's one thing that you can do with it. There's a prominent astrophysicist named Alexander Balenkin. He sounds like an astrophysicist, doesn't he? And this is his theory, that our fantastic, glorious universe spontaneously arose from nothing at all. If the theory holds, we owe our existence to the humblest of origins, nothing itself. I just kind of find that funny. Like, praise be to the almighty nothing, through whom we have come into being. I mean, can you read that and say that belief in God is that much more unrealistic than this? Stuff popping into existence from nothing? That's kind of what you have to say, though, if you're not going to go with God. And then there's another argument that's closely tied to that, the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God.
Mike?
And the mic is...
Went off.
I'm off? Oh, no. Guys... man. No. I'll use that hand. All right, good? Good? Nope. Check. Good. You all, I'm speaking so loud that you hope that I wouldn't pick up the mic, but here we are. All right, fine-tuning argument for the existence of God. Modern science has shown that there are all these factors, all these kind of measurements that had to be so precise for the universe to come into existence the way it is. So one example of that is the strength of gravity. Apparently, if the strength of gravity was even a fraction of a percentage different, so that your weight was a billionth of a gram heavier or lighter, again, if that's what the strength of gravity did, a billionth of a gram heavier or lighter, the universe wouldn't have come into existence. You wouldn't have had planets, you wouldn't have had stars, none of that. And there are all of these dials that had to be that precise. It's been said that when you put those all together, the chance that this universe came into existence is 1 in 10 to the 138th power, which is a massive, unimaginably large number. It's been said that the number of atoms in the whole universe, and I don't know how they count this, I would hate to be the guy. They probably have other ways of doing it. But the number of atoms in the universe is 1 in 10 to the 70th power. We're talking about 1 in 10 to the 138th power. Buy a lottery ticket at those odds, I dare you. I mean, the point is that all of this kind of points to what Genesis 1 verse 1 says. That this universe has a cause. This world that we live in came from someone. And that someone is called God. That's the first kind of aspect we see right here in the beginning. Here's a second. God is creator and that He alone is God. You probably know that polytheism ruled the day in the ancient world. The people believed in many gods, and these gods weren't really that impressive. They fought with each other, they slept together, they argued with each other. It was one big hot mess up there in the heavens. And the Bible says, no, that there aren't multiple gods. There's one God. He's God alone. However, the Bible, and I just want to point this out, the Bible does not say that God was alone. See, the Old Testament talks about something called the heavenly council or the divine assembly. And it's this group of creatures, supernatural, spiritual creatures who kind of form God's heavenly court in some ways. And Satan is pictured as one of those in the Old Testament. And I say that here because actually I think we come across this divine council in verse 26. We'll spend a lot more time on this verse in a few weeks, but where God creates humans and He says, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. All of a sudden you've got this first person plural and you go, what's this about? People used to think, and people still do think, that this is a reference to the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But if we are to look at this the way an Israelite would have looked at it, how they would have understood it, I think we'd have to say that the first reference here is to this divine council, this heavenly assembly. Now that doesn't mean that they actually, these created supernatural beings have the power to make anything happen. It's kind of like if Carolyn's out for dinner, and so I've got the kids and I've got to feed them. And we know that the chances of the kitchen burning down are significantly higher than 1 in 10 to the 138th power if I try to cook dinner for us. So I say to our kids, let's go get sushi. And because they're cultured West Coast kids, unlike me growing up, they like raw fish. And so they go, yeah, sounds good. Now, it's my idea. I'm going to drive us there. I'm going to pay for it. My kids, as wonderful and smart as they are not making this happen on their own. They're along for the ride. That's it. I'm doing all the work here. And that's kind of the picture here. God gets to the sixth day. He's going to make humans. And He's so excited about this. This is the climax of His creation. And so He says, check this out. Look what we're doing here. Isn't this incredible? So God's not alone. Wow. Wow. And let there be light. No? Oh boy. What is this? That was great. I appreciated all the phones. Yeah. Okay. So many connections with Genesis 1. Right? So many connections. Where was I? Does anyone know? I have no idea.
So let there be light.
Let there be light? I did say that. Yeah. Day 6. Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay. Think we're good, Justin? Good? And the mic's off? Hello? Check. This guy's off? Can you hear me? All right. Yeah? Okay. Check. No?
Try again.
Check. 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 All right, Jesse, tell me when this is good. Okay. I'll leave it there. Okay. All right. We're going to try this. Who's it? Whitfield, back in the 18th century, he would preach to like 10,000 people without a microphone, so I should be able to handle a couple hundred, right? We should be able to do this.
You're good.
Check. All right, sixth day, God creates humans. It says, let us do this, and it's first person plural. Okay, yeah, and then he's not alone, but he is God alone. That's where we are. Okay. He's not alone, but he is God alone. There's no one else. And you see this throughout Genesis 1. There's a few interesting things I want to point out here. So in the ancient world, one of the common gods that kind of everybody had was the sun. The sun was deified, personified as a god. Listen to what God says in day 4. Verse 14, and God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night. And then verse 16, God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. Well, which lights is he talking about? He's talking about the sun and the moon, of course. Why doesn't he call it the sun and the moon? Because the Hebrew words for sun and the moon were taken from other cultures and other languages where those words were the names of those gods. And Genesis 1 wants to be really, really clear. The sun and the moon are not gods. They are not to be personified or deified, that they are creatures that God has made. Same thing with the watery deep in verse 2. The darkness and the deep were often personified as these divine forces of chaos. And in Genesis 1, they are not that. They are created things that just indicate that God is not finished with his creation yet. And then you have this as well. In the ancient world, often creation, in those stories, creation came about through competition between the gods. So, whoa, all those stair lights just came on. This is a fun morning. Oh, creation came about through competition between the gods. So in one of the Babylonian creation stories, there is this, it's actually quite a mess. Conflict and warfare between the different gods, and then other gods are created, and then they're at war with these other gods. And eventually there's this god named Marduk. And Marduk is summoned to do battle against Tiamat, who's like this primal goddess who's just causing chaos. And Marduk says, okay, I'll go fight her, but only if I win, you make me the supreme high god. And all the other gods are like, okay, sounds good. And then he goes and he defeats her, he destroys her, and this is what we read. This is beautiful, stirring poetry by the Babylonians. And then the Lord Marduk paused to view her dead body, Tiamat, that he might divide the monster and do artful works. He split her like a shellfish into 2 parts. Half of her he set up and sealed it as sky, pulled down the bar and posted guards. I mean, that's soul-stirring, isn't it? The Babylonians had a way with words. Split her like a shellfish. And so the picture here is that the waters above and below are formed from Tiamat's corpse. That's one view of it. Genesis 1 just has God saying, let there be waters, let there be light. He just speaks and things happen. It doesn't happen through struggle, through fighting, through warfare with other gods. There's no competition. God just speaks and it happens. Now, how does this reframe the way that we see God? Because probably if you were to do a survey on the streets of North Vancouver, polytheism is probably not high up on the list of options for who God is. If you were to ask your friends in high school, where rain comes from, most would probably not say from Tiamat's dead corpse, would be my guess. That would not be a popular option. So how does this reframe the world? Well, idolatry was a problem for Israel. They had such a hard time understanding that God could have no rivals, that he was God alone. That took a long, long time to get through to them. We're actually no different. We live in a world that is rife with idolatry. It's just a different form. They just have different names. There's a cable show called American Gods. I haven't seen it, but apparently it portrays a battle between the old gods like Odin and the new gods, the American gods, who have names like media and technology and globalization. See, we don't worship gods made out of stone and wood anymore. We worship gods made out of silicone and glass. I mean, here's a test question. If you had to spend one whole day either without ever looking or touching your phone or without being consciously aware of God's presence, what sounds more difficult for you? What sounds easier for you? To spend a whole day without looking or touching your phone or without being consciously aware of God's presence? See, the truth is, whatever we cognitively believe and say we believe about God being God alone, our hearts and our lives often indicate the opposite. That we think that God really does have rivals, that he does have competition, that there are other things that have a claim to the throne of our lives. Whether that's technology and media, or even our families, or status, or money, whatever we think we desperately need to give us meaning and purpose and life has challenged God for the throne of our lives. But Genesis 1 says that doesn't line up with reality. And that if you try to bring anyone into the competition with God, it's going to fail you. In fact, it might even destroy you. That's the nature of idolatry. If we allow Genesis 1 to reframe our view of God, we're going to see that he can be God alone, not only in the cosmos, not only in the universe, but in our lives too. Here's the third thing we see about God here. That he is a God of blessing. And again, this wasn't something that was true of the gods of old. They didn't really care about humans. They didn't really care about blessing the world. They were kind of in it for themselves. But God is a God of blessing. He says this directly a couple of times. When I think it's day 5, when he makes the birds and the fish. Verse 22, we read, God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. He blessed them and said, increase, fill the place. And then again in verse 28, after creating humans, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. See, this is God's blessing in creation. He makes a world and says, fill it. It's ready for you. Fill it with life. It's all made for flourishing of life. And that connects with another word that is repeated over and over again in Genesis 1. It's the word good. God makes stuff, and again and again and again, he saw that it was good. Actually, there's only one day that doesn't get that description. You know what day it is? The 6th day gets very good, but the 2nd day doesn't get any reference to it being good. And you know what the 2nd day is in Hebrew work week? What's the 2nd day? It's a Monday. Even God sees. Mondays are no good. Now, a more serious possibility is that on the 2nd day, God creates the waters, or he separates the waters. And again, in the ancient understanding, the waters were identified as these forces of chaos. Now, they're not deified or personified in Genesis, but they still are associated with chaos, with what doesn't foster life or flourishing. See, that's what the word good means in Hebrew. It means that which is ordered, that which is set up for life and flourishing. It's the same idea with blessing. God blesses it, he's structured it, he's ordered it for life and flourishing. That's the idea. And that's different from how we often think of the word good in Genesis. We often think that the word good is equal to the word perfect. As in, God makes the world, and it is perfect, and if anybody even moves a leaf, it's ruined. It's wrecked. It's kind of like, if you ever have people over at your house, and if you have kids, and they have kids, you do this like weird thing where you clean up before they come. Like you put away all the toys, and you clean the floors, you clean the bathrooms, like who does that? And you make everything like spotless, just pristine. And you know that like 5 minutes later, like 5 minutes after your guests come, it's all going to be ruined anyway. Like it's all like it's fruitless, but you do it anyway, and then you tell your kids like go up into your room and don't touch anything for the next hour because you're just going to ruin it. It's all perfect right now, and you're just going to ruin it. Does anybody else do that? No? Okay. So that's kind of the idea that we think of the world, but that's not what the words in Hebrew mean. It doesn't mean that it's perfect. The world that God created is good, but it's wild. Why else does God say to the humans, subdue it and rule it? Why do you need to subdue something unless it still needs some work? It needs filling. It needs forming. That's the whole point of blessing. It's the whole point of goodness, that it is structured and ordered for human flourishing. It's kind of the whole fine-tuning argument again, that God has made the world in exactly the way that it needs to be for life to prosper and grow in this place. Now, how does this reframe the way that we see God and the way that we see the world? Well, one way is that I think when we experience that kind of flourishing and life, when we experience that, a lot of people think that it's because of their intelligence, or because of their hard work, or because of their giftedness, which of course it is in some way, or they maybe think it's just dumb luck, which again, maybe it is in some way. But we think ultimately that it's kind of about us when we experience that kind of life and flourishing that I'm talking about. But Genesis 1 says that it's not because of you. It's because this is the kind of world that God has made. This is His intention. This is His desire to bless and to foster life. And so it moves us from this kind of prideful self-sufficiency. It moves us to a humble gratitude when we experience this. Because it ultimately is praise to God for making the world as He has. And the second way I think it reframes the way we see God in particular is that a lot of people think about God in the Old Testament especially. Whether they've never really been to church, or whether they maybe still are in church and they still have faith, but if they're honest with you, they still kind of question God's character. They still kind of feel like God is mostly an angry, vengeful, judgmental God, especially in the Old Testament. Do you know what I mean? That's kind of like what we think as being kind of like that's the primary fundamental thing about God in the Old Testament. And Genesis 1 says no. No, God's fundamental orientation is to bless, is to give life. His fundamental orientation is to enable us to flourish and grow. That's what He wants. And He is a God who judges and a God who displays wrath, but He only does that because we live and act in ways that undermine His desire to bless and to bring life. And we live and act in ways that brings the opposite. That's where that aspect of God's character comes. But His fundamental orientation, His basic desire, is to bless. It's right there in Genesis 1. Let that reframe the way that you think about the world, about God in particular. Two more things, really quickly. We'll go through these a lot more quickly. Genesis 1 shows us that God is a God who works, and He likes it. He works. Again, the ancient gods, they didn't really like work very much. In fact, they kind of created humans just so that the humans would do the dirty work for them and they didn't have to do the work anymore. But God isn't like that. He makes the world. That's a pretty big job. The thing I've ever made was this lopsided CD shelf in grade 7 woodworking class. And it took me all semester. That was the most impressive thing I ever made. God made the universe. That's a lot of work. And He likes it. Over and over and over again, He says, it's good, it's good, it's going good. Do you hear the joy? Do you hear God's joy in making the world and creating this place? He's satisfied with His work. He likes what He's doing. And the rest of the Bible shows that God continues to work. He continues to sustain and uphold his creation. Whatever else it means for God to rest, which we'll talk about, it doesn't mean that he stops working. He is very much continually at work, and he takes joy in his work. Now that's going to have implications for how we as humans work. That's week, 6 or 7, I think 6. So more on that later. But the fifth thing connected to it is that God is present in his creation. Check out this comparison, this analogy. In the ancient world, there were these temple inauguration manuals, rituals. They found these. And in the ancient world, when you had built a temple and you wanted it to function as a temple, it was often a 7-day ceremony that climaxed with the installation of the image of the God, whose temple this was, the image or the statue of this God. And there was this process even where the statue or the image would have kind of breath breathed into it. That was believed to kind of be the God's presence filling that statue, making it a functioning idol. And then the temple was now functioning. It was a resting place for that God. Okay, that's the ancient world. Genesis 1. God makes the world. It's a 7-day process. At the climax of it, he installs his images, which are not made of wood or stone, but are human beings, living human beings. He fills them with his breath, makes them functioning representatives of his presence, and then he rests there. He rests in his temple. What's his temple? It's the whole universe. It's the cosmos. He's made it as a receptacle for his presence. You see what I mean? And there are all these other parallels. Like even the lights that we read about in day 4, it's a rare word that's used again about the lights in the tabernacle sanctuary, representing the presence of God there. Another big part of the temple thing was always a garden in the ancient world. Genesis 2, we come across a garden. There are all these indications that the point of Genesis 1 underneath it all is that the world is a temple for God's presence, and we are his images here, filled with his presence. Now you think about how that reframes the world. There is this way of thinking that we could call deism. And this has long been something that people have thought. That God exists, and he made the world, but he kind of like made it, and then he just kind of stepped away. He set it into motion like a watchmaker, and then he just kind of stepped away and was like, cool, look at this thing just go on its own. Actually, 15 years ago, there was this groundbreaking study that looked at the religious beliefs of American teenagers. There was a couple of sociologists that did this. So these teenagers would now be in their 20s and 30s. But they found that the dominant system of belief was what they called moral therapeutic deism. And the idea here is that God exists, and he really wants you to be happy. And he doesn't really care very much about what you do, how you live your life. He just really wants you to be happy. And if you really get into trouble, he'll show up and bail you out. He's basically like a kindly old great-grandfather who hangs out in the retirement home, and he's just happy if you come visit him once every 2 months. And he'll probably give you a $100 bill or something and be like, here, have fun with it. And that's basically who God is in that kind of moral therapeutic deism. God wants you to be happy, doesn't get involved unless you're really in trouble, and then he gets out of your business again. Again, that's not Genesis 1. Genesis 1 says that God is intimately involved in every aspect of his creation, that he wants to be present in this world and present in and through you. To sum it all up, Genesis 1 gives us this picture that God exists, that he is the creator, the maker of all things, that he is God alone, nobody else is God, nobody else can create, he is infinitely greater than any created being, that this God is a God of blessing, a God who desires to do good and to foster life and flourishing, that this is a God who works and enjoys it, and a God who is present. Those are some pretty significant claims, wouldn't you say? Doesn't that sharpen the way that we see God? But here's one more claim that I want to tell you about. I'll finish with this. It's not a claim that Genesis makes. It's not a claim that the Old Testament makes. necessarily. It's a claim in the New Testament, which is that the same God that we meet in Genesis 1 has come into the flesh, has become a human, became one of us in the person of Jesus Christ. And you think about some of the stories about Jesus. Think about that story where he's in the boat with his disciples, and there's this huge storm, and it threatens to overturn them and drown them and destroy them, and Jesus stands up and he just speaks a word, and creation listens. The wind and the waves are silent. Jesus has the power to speak, and creation listens. Where have you seen that before? Or think about that story where Jesus' friend Lazarus died and was in the tomb. For 4 days, he was really dead. And Jesus showed up, and he stood outside the tomb, and he said, "Lazarus, come out." And all of a sudden, there was Lazarus, 4 days dead, walking out. Jesus has the power to speak life into existence. Where have you seen that? Everywhere you look in the Gospels, Jesus is going around working to bring about life and flourishing. The man with the shriveled hand, Jesus speaks the word and it's healed. The woman who's been bleeding for 12 years comes and touches the edge of Jesus' cloak and she is made well. The guys with leprosy who are cut off from the rest of society, who are unclean, Jesus heals them over and over again. Jesus is bringing about life and restoration. See, this morning, I pray that you would allow Genesis 1 to reframe the way that you see God. But I also pray that it would enable you to see Jesus more clearly, to help you see who he is and what he's done. See, as we're going to look at in the next number of months, something has gone wrong in creation. Something has gone wrong with us. And Jesus has come. God is taking on flesh to heal us and to restore us to who we were created to be. He's come to breathe his breath into us once again and make us fully functioning images of God. Again, more on that, but I pray that this morning you would see God more clearly and that you would see that Jesus is one worth giving your life to and trusting in for salvation, because there is nobody like him. Let's pray.